Liza had a solitary first 3 years of her life, with her only companion being Betty, who was also a maid to her mother. Betty had smiled when she explained to Liza that they both had the same name, because Liza was really Elizabeth. It would be a little while before she was always called Liza. The highlight of little Elizabeth's days was when Betty spent time reading to her, and although so very young, she gradually began to distinguish the words for herself. Betty took great pleasure in extolling to the rest of the staff how clever she felt that the little girl was, for which she took credit. All the staff took great interest in Elizabeth, as they felt that she received very little in the way of love from her parents, and now that her mother was about to bring forth another child, they felt that she would be pushed into the shadows even more. The cook, Mrs. Walsh, made a point of letting the little girl attempt to cook on at least one afternoon a week, although the results were mostly inedible, but it was an enjoyable time for her. There were also times when Mr. Ridgway, the gardener, helped her to dig holes for the plants that he thought she would like. A nurse arrived one day, followed shortly by a doctor, which meant that the birth of a new Donahue child was imminent. Nurse Bentley was very efficient, but also friendly and motherly, and instantly took a liking to little Elizabeth. "I think that little Elizabeth should go to one of her friends," said Nurse Bentley. "She has no friends, nurse," said Betty. Her mother did not want her to mix with anyone. "Why ever not?" demanded Nurse Bentley. Both Mrs. Walsh and Betty just shook their heads with resigned looks on their faces. "I'll take her to my place," said Mr. Ridgway. "My wife is at home today. She can have her tea with us. My daughter will be pleased to see her. I'm not so sure about my son. He thinks that girls are silly. The way things are going, I'm sure it will all be over by this afternoon, so Betty can come and collect her later," said Nurse Bentley. Elizabeth was in her room poring over a little book that Betty had given her. She was frowning and seemed to be listening to noises coming from her mother's room. Betty came to tell her that she was going to visit Mrs. Ridgway and her children that day. "Oh, that's nice. Does my mother know?" asked Elizabeth. "Your mother is busy, so Nurse Bentley has arranged it for you. Mr. Ridgway is waiting for you," said Betty. "There are some strange noises coming from my mother's room," said Elizabeth. "Yes, she's singing," said Betty lamely. "Oh," said a thoughtful Elizabeth. "She's not very good at it, is she?" Betty smothered a laugh and just managed to nod her agreement. Mr. Ridgway held Elizabeth's hand as they walked the short distance to his home. Mrs. Ridgway was surprised to see them, but soon had Elizabeth enjoying lunch and told her that her son and daughter would shortly be home from school. "I'd like to go to school. I'd like to meet other children," said Elizabeth. "Well, my dear, perhaps one day you'll be able to," said a kindly Mrs. Ridgway. When the Ridgway children came in from school, Mr. Ridgway had been right that his son would take absolutely no notice of Elizabeth, but his daughter was delighted to show her some of her toys and to help her read one of her books. It was well after supper time that Betty came to collect Elizabeth, and she had the news that a little boy had been born to the Donahue household. Elizabeth's bright green eyes lit up with pleasure. "I've got a brother," whispered Elizabeth to herself, and then she turned to Betty and asked if they could go and see him. "I don't know. Your mother is very tired, but you'll be able to see him tomorrow," said Betty, and she hoped that she was right, and that Elizabeth would be able to see her new brother the following day. Back in the kitchen at home, Elizabeth was having some hot milk before going to bed. Nurse Bentley was also there taking 5 minutes rest before being on duty during the night. "Well, young Elizabeth, you have a little brother to love," smiled Nurse Bentley. "I would like to see him, but Betty says that mother is tired. I suppose my brother is also tired. Has he come very far?" asked an innocent Elizabeth. Nurse Bentley smiled and said, "Yes, it was rather a long journey, but he's resting now, and I'll make sure you see him tomorrow." Elizabeth looked up from her hot milk, and her green eyes sparkled with excitement. "I must wear my best clothes to meet my brother." "He won't know what you're wearing, Elizabeth," said Nurse Bentley kindly. "He will, and so will I," said little Elizabeth. "I will give him one of my toys. I have one that I have always loved. I was told that my mother made it for me when I was born." "Really? She made it for you?" asked Mrs. Walsh. Said Elizabeth. Well, somebody made it for me, but I was told that my mother gave it to me. It's my favourite. My brother will love it. Are you sure you want to give away your favourite toy? Asked Nurse Bentley. Of course. He's my brother, said Elizabeth, and she and Betty made their way up to her room and found the soft toy that was destined for her brother. She also told Betty which dress she was going to wear when she met him for the first time. She climbed into bed, and Betty wondered whether she would be able to sleep that night, as she was so excited about seeing her brother the following day. Returning to the kitchen, Betty commented that she hoped that Elizabeth would not be disappointed. She is so happy at the prospect of seeing the baby tomorrow. I do hope that they don't stop her. Why should they do that? Asked Nurse Bentley. It's only natural that she should be included tomorrow. I do feel that the girl is not treated as she should be. It's not really my business. I will, however, make sure that she meets the baby. That child has a lot of love to give, and she wants to give it to her brother. It's very sad that some parents do not know how to treat their children. Little Elizabeth was up and dressed early the next morning. She sat on her bed, waiting and clasping the soft knitted toy that she was going to give to her brother. Come down to the kitchen for a while, Elizabeth, said Betty. I think that Mr. Ridgway has found some flowers for you to give to your mother. I don't want to get dirty, and I want to be ready as soon as I am told I can see him, said Elizabeth. I've also been sorting out some books that he may like me to read to him. You're very kind, said Betty. If you come down to the kitchen, we'll make sure that you see him as soon as you are told that you can. You should also have some breakfast, and I won't let you get dirty. Nurse Bentley hurried into the kitchen, saying that she would take Elizabeth up to see her brother now, although she did not look happy about it, but Elizabeth did not notice that. Elizabeth says that she's going to read to him, smiled Betty. She's a bit young to be able to read. It will be a year or two before she can do that, said the nurse. She can read, said Betty and Mrs. Walsh in unison. The nurse looked at Elizabeth and said, Really? That's very clever of her. She is very clever, said a defensive Betty. Come on, Elizabeth, let's go and see the youngster. I see you have the toy and some flowers for your mother. That should make her happy, said Nurse Bentley, not very convincingly. Elizabeth's father was also in with her mother and brother, and the first words to come from her mother were, I didn't say that you could yet visit. The look on the little girl's face was heartbreaking, but Nurse Bentley butted in and said, I know you didn't, but I did. She has every right to meet her little brother. She has a gift for him and some flowers for you. The nurse is right, Sheila, said her father. Let her see him. The smile that Liza gave them both was wonderful to see, and her green eyes sparkled with pleasure. And as she looked at the little baby, they changed to love. He's lovely, she said. What's his name? We've called him William, said her father. I think it suits him. Hello, William, said Elizabeth. I have a present for you. And she placed the toy next to him in the cradle. I hope that's clean, snapped her mother. Of course it is, said Nurse Bentley. You don't think that I would allow anything dirty to go near him, do you? You have something for your mother, don't you, Elizabeth? Elizabeth nodded and handed the flowers to her mother, but quickly went back to looking at William. She gently reached into the cradle and smoothed the small amount of fair hair that he had. Sheila drew in her breath, but one look from Nurse Bentley and another from her husband soon stopped what she was going to say. Can I read to him later? Asked Elizabeth. Don't be silly, you can't yet read, snapped her mother. Yes, I can, said Elizabeth, without realising that she was arguing. Yes, she can, said Nurse Bentley. I'm sure that such books as the Bible or a newspaper are beyond her, but I am assured that she is quite capable of reading one of her books to her brother. Really? Said her father in surprise. I had no idea. I think that you have a very clever daughter, and I'm sure that your son will follow in her footsteps, said Nurse Bentley. Elizabeth was smoothing William's head when Betty arrived to take her back to her room, and as she moved away, little William started crying. She moved back and continued stroking him, and he quietened down. Twice she did this, and twice he cried, and then quietened. William, she said, I have to leave you now, but you have my toy to keep you company until I can come back. He made a small noise and went back to sleep, and Elizabeth turned around and smiled happily at both her mother and father before leaving with Betty. As the door closed, her mother told Nurse Bentley to get rid of the toy. The nurse turned and looked at her coldly. She has given that toy to him with love, and it is a great sacrifice on her part. You should know that it is her favourite toy, as you gave it to her, and she has cherished it all this time, said Nurse Bentley. Who says that I gave it to her? Said Sheila. She did. She told us that it was a gift from her mother, and you are her mother, so it must have come from you. It means a great deal to her, but if you want to upset her, then I will take it away and give it back to her, said Nurse Bentley. Her father butted in, saying that of course he should have the gift. There would be no harm in it. Nurse Bentley breathed a sigh of relief. She found it difficult to understand the animosity that Sheila Donoghue showed towards her daughter. It had to be a form of jealousy, and she was pleased that at least the staff within the house showed affection towards the little girl. She would be pleased when she could leave the household, as instead of the joy that normally was felt when a baby arrived, it was a dark and depressing atmosphere within that family. As time went on, Elizabeth and William were inseparable. When he was learning to speak, he had great difficulty with her name. Firstly, he called her Lizab, until finally she became Liza, not only to him, but to all else in the household. They spent many hours together each day. Mr. Ridgway helped them plant a garden each. Liza's was full of roses, and William's had anything else that looked pretty. William seemed to be a little accident-prone, and every time he fell, Liza got the blame. You should be more careful with your brother. You know that he follows you, and you lead him astray every time, said Sheila Donoghue. She doesn't, Mother, said little William. It's not her fault. Don't answer back, William. And you, Liza, go to your room and stay there until tomorrow morning, said their mother. William looked downhearted and whispered, I suppose you won't have any supper tonight. Don't worry, William, I had a good lunch. And she slowly made her way up to her room, where she settled reading a good book. William crept into her room after his supper, and he delved down into one of his pockets and brought out a rather crumbled and fluffy piece of dry bread and a small cake from another pocket, which was in an even worse condition. You are good, William. That will keep me going until the morning, said Liza. I'm sorry, but I couldn't get any butter for your bread, said William. That's all right, William. I'll enjoy it as it is, said Liza. It wasn't your fault that I fell over. You were not near me when I did that, said William. Don't worry about it, William, said Liza. You had better get to your bed now, otherwise you'll also be in trouble. No, you know that she'll blame you, said a very sad William. Liza kissed him good night and told him that tomorrow would be better. Liza was teaching William to read, and he was doing quite well. But when he was nearly 5 years old, their father decided that a tutor should be employed for him. He did say that Liza could sit in on the lessons if she wished. The tutor, Mr. Salmon, arrived one morning and moved into his bedroom, and then organised a small room as a classroom for both Liza and William. He was a small, thin man who looked older than his years. He immediately recognised that Liza was highly intelligent, and he encouraged her in all lessons. William tried, but was not really interested in any form of learning. He had mastered reading, but that was about as far as he wished to learn. At the age of 8, Liza started learning French, and she seemed to have a natural aptitude for languages. Within 6 months she was also tackling German, which she was finding even easier, as she realised that much of that language was similar to English. Shall we try Spanish next? She said one day to Mr. Salmon. Don't you think that you should master French and German before you go on to a third language, said Mr. Salmon. I suppose you're right, said a disappointed Liza. Well, let's give it another month before we think about that again, said Mr. Salmon. Also, you are neglecting mathematics, and you could need that in the future. By the time she had reached the age of 9, Spanish was well part of her lessons. She often wondered why Mr. Salmon was spending his time in their household, as he was a very expert teacher and would be better suited in a university. She did notice that some days he seemed to be unwell, and she was always very caring of him at such times. When Liza turned 10 years old, her life changed forever. Liza was excited. It was her 10th birthday, and Mrs. Walsh had made her a cake and a special tea for William and herself, as well as every member of staff. Her mother had handed her some new handkerchiefs and her father had wished her a happy birthday, but that was as far as they went for that day. Betty had planned what William would get her, and he had taken great pleasure in wrapping a pretty pair of gloves for her, and Mrs. Walsh had a new apron for her, as she said that she would definitely need it as she was so messy in the kitchen. Mr. Salmon had bought her a few books, one in each language that she was studying, and Mr. Ridgway had chosen a beautiful red rose bush for her to plant in her garden. She, William and Mr. Ridgway studied where to put the rose, and soon it was in pride of place, near where they would all be able to smell the beautiful scent. Betty called them into the kitchen, and when they had washed their hands, everyone sat down to a lovely tea, and finally they had to make room for the cake that Mrs. Walsh had so painstakingly iced and decorated. "It's a shame to cut it," said Liza. "It looks so pretty. I'm sure it's going to taste just as good as it looks." All the staff were upset at the way Liza was being treated by her parents on her birthday, and every other day of her life, but Liza was enjoying her birthday tea. She was with the people that she loved, and they showed love for her. William was chatting away happily over the meal. He preferred to be down with the staff in the kitchen. He felt that his parents were not only unfair to Liza, but he was treated with little love by them, although it was obvious that out of the two he was the favourite. Over the course of that summer, Mr. Ridgway taught the children how to take cuttings and how to graft one plant onto another. They had planted seeds earlier in the year and were now taking pleasure in planting out what they had succeeded in growing. Mostly Liza's garden had roses in it. They were her favourite flowers. William just liked anything that grew, and his garden often looked unruly, but he was happy with it. As it turned to autumn, both Liza and William were picking the last of the flowering roses, and Liza noticed that William was becoming rather short of breath. "I think we ought to go inside and rest for a while," said Liza. "I know Mr. Salmon is waiting for us, and it will be good for you to sit down." "Yes, Liza," said William. "Will you hold my hand? I don't feel too well." "Of course I will," smiled Liza. Mr. Ridgway was looking on concerned, and he said that he would bring her flowers into the house. Liza and William walked slowly in through the kitchen. Mrs. Walsh looked up and then suggested that William should go and lie down, as he looked unwell. "I'll send Betty up with some tea for you," said Mrs. Walsh. "Is my mother home?" asked Liza. "No, she's out visiting a friend," said Betty. Liza knew that her father was not working at home that day, so it was down to her to make sure that William was cared for. As they walked up the stairs towards William's room, Mr. Salmon came out, having assumed that they were coming in for their lessons, but he took one look at William and realised that the child was beginning to look quite sick. "I think that we need a doctor," said Liza. "Can you arrange that for me, please, Mr. Salmon? And can you find out if anyone knows where my mother has gone?" Mr. Salmon nodded, as he realised that William had more than just a chill. "I think that you need to get into bed, William." "Come on, I'll help you into your nightshirt," said Liza, "and then I'll make sure you are propped up on your pillows, which will help you to breathe. You don't sound too good, but the doctor will be here shortly. He'll look after you." "I want you to look after me, please, Liza." "I will do my best, William, but the doctor will know what the matter is and what the cure will be," said Liza. She helped him out of his clothes and into his nightshirt, and as promised, she made sure that he was virtually sitting up in bed. And when she had done that, the doctor had arrived. "Where are your parents?" the doctor asked Liza. "I really don't know, but my mother will be at one of her friends, and I believe Betty is trying to track her down, and my father is not working at home today. He is at one of his clients' firms, and I don't know which one," said Liza, who was beginning to realise that William's condition was much more serious than she had first thought. By that time, William's breathing had become very noisy, and the doctor said that he dare not leave until at least one of the parents had returned. "Is it very serious?" asked Liza quietly, and the doctor looked at her and realised that she was a great deal older than her years. He knew that he should only talk to her parents, but he did admit that William was indeed quite ill. "Liza, will you please hold me?" asked William gently. "I'm very frightened." "No need to be frightened, William. I'll hold you, but not too tightly, as you need to catch your breath," said Liza. The doctor was looking on with concern. He had seen many children like William, and knew that his health could deteriorate very quickly. and he would be lucky to come out of it alive. He watched as Liza settled herself on the bed and put her arm around her brother, and he could see that just that act seemed to relieve the little boy. Mr. Salmon made his way into the room and said that unfortunately Mrs. Donahue had yet to be found. "I do have other patients to see, but I cannot leave until at least one parent has returned," said the doctor. "Young Liza seems to have calmed him down a little." "They are very close," said Mr. Salmon, and the doctor nodded and said that he could see that. Finally, Liza's mother rushed in and the doctor pulled her to one side, telling her how serious her son's illness was. She turned to Liza and shouted that it was all down to her. The doctor was taken aback and said, "It has nothing to do with your daughter. She has done everything to ease the situation. Nobody is at fault here. I'm afraid these things happen. It cannot be helped, and I just hope that he is strong enough to pull through this. I must go now, as I have other patients to attend to, but I will return later to see how things are going." The doctor left, and when he was out of earshot, Liza's mother turned on her and shouted for her to leave the room. "You are not wanted here." William started crying and pleading for Liza not to leave him, but her mother grabbed her by the arm and pushed her out of the room, slamming the door after her. She had forgotten that Mr. Salmon was still in the room, and he turned on the woman and said, "That is a very hurtful thing to do, Mrs. Donahue. You can see that young William wants his sister with him, and you can also see that Liza feels the need to be with him. Mind yourself, Mr. Salmon. Don't forget who pays your wages," said Mrs. Donahue, and all the while William was crying pitifully and gasping for breath at the same time. Mr. Salmon left the room and found Liza standing in a daze outside the door. "Come with me, Liza. We'll go into the schoolroom and try to occupy ourselves." "William needs me, Mr. Salmon. I must try to be with him," said Liza. "You can't, Liza, but we'll stay as close as we can," said Mr. Salmon. Liza's eyes had become enormous as the realization that her beloved brother was dying and she had no way of helping him. All she could do was try to talk to him in her mind and hoped that he could hear her. Mr. Salmon could see that she was totally preoccupied, and her powers of concentration frightened him slightly. "What are you doing, Liza?" asked Mr. Salmon. "I'm trying to communicate with William, and I think that I am beginning to do that," said Liza quietly. Her father arrived home, and he realised that something was wrong, which made him quickly make his way up the stairs, and even through the closed door he could hear William gasping for breath. Liza heard him open the door, and she quickly made her way into William's room with him and immediately went over to his bed. Her mother screamed at her to take her hands off her boy, much to her father's surprise and horror. Liza stayed as long as she was able, and in that time she stroked William's head, as she had done when he was first born, and it seemed to calm him a little, and all the while she was trying to build some form of mental communication with him. Once again Liza was pushed out of the room, and the door slammed after her. This time she sat on the floor outside the room and continued to stare into space, hoping that she was helping her brother. Mr. Salmon came out of the schoolroom and looked down on Liza, and he found it difficult to hide the tears that he was shedding for her. He felt sad for William, but he felt far sorrier for Liza. Mrs. Walsh made her way up the stairs after Mr. Salmon had told her how Liza was being treated. "Come with me, little one," said Mrs. Walsh kindly. "No, I can't do that. I'm trying to talk to William. I must stay here," said Liza. "You must eat something," said Mrs. Walsh. Liza just shook her head and carried on concentrating. She stayed like that all night, and in the early hours of the morning she heard William cry out her name, and then there was silence, and Liza knew that he had gone. She heard her mother scream and her father sob. Slowly she got up from the floor and made her way to her room and closed the door. Betty came in to her later that morning, but nobody else had been in to see her. "Come down to the kitchen, Liza," said Betty. "No, I'm fine here," said Liza. She got out one of her books and began reading. Down in the kitchen, the usually very discreet Mr. Salmon voiced loudly what he thought of the situation. "That was one of the cruelest things that I have ever come across. Both those children were breaking their hearts because they were kept apart. William needed Liza, and she in turn needed to be with him. His passing would have been much easier if they had been allowed to be together, and she will probably suffer for the rest of her life because of that," said Mr. Salmon. "No doubt I will soon be asked to leave, as they really only thought that William should be educated. It is going to be a shame because Liza has an ability to learn which is well beyond her years." "Perhaps I had better take something up to her room," said Mrs. Walsh. "I'll take it," said Betty. Liza ate very little over the following 2 days, and when it was the day of William's funeral, Liza went into the boy's room and found the knitted toy that she had given him when he was born. She made her way down to where he was lying in his small coffin, and placed the toy in his hands, and then stroked his hair, as she had so often done when he was alive. "Goodbye, William," she whispered. The door opened and her parents walked in. "Get out of here," snarled her mother. "Get out and stop touching him and get rid of that awful toy. It should be you there and not him." Liza turned and stared at her mother so long that it unnerved the woman. "I am well aware of the way that you feel, and you may be surprised to know that I feel the same way. But here we are, and I'm telling you that toy stays with him. It will give him much comfort on his final journey. Leave him in peace," said a very adult-sounding Liza. Her mother was too surprised to argue, and her father just said, "Leave it be, Sheila." Liza held her head high and walked towards the door as the undertakers arrived, and she watched as they placed the lid on William's coffin. She was pleased that his toy had remained with him. She turned and made her way up to her room, and once again took out a book and began reading. Mr. Salmon came to find her, and he coaxed her into the schoolroom, as he felt that at least it was a change for her from her room. "What would you like to do today, Liza?" he asked. "I'd like to concentrate on Spanish for a while," said Liza, which is what they did to the exclusion of all else. Liza's days passed with filling her mind with everything that Mr. Salmon could impart to her. She went to the kitchen for her meals and returned to either the schoolroom or her room between meals. Christmas came and there was no joy in the house. Liza did not bother to join her parents for any meals. She just felt that it was natural to go to the kitchen and be with people who she could talk to if she wished. The only presents that she received were from the staff, and sadly she had no money to buy any in return. Mr. Salmon was beginning to worry about her, as she did nothing but learn, and much as she was an excellent student, he felt that she should have some recreational time. "It will soon be spring," said Mr. Ridgway. "I'll try to persuade her to help me in the garden then." She always enjoyed that, but of course so did William. "I hope that she will be able to work with me, and I have to say that I have missed that sunny smile that she always had. It may come back as time goes by." Easter crept up on them, and Mr. Salmon was surprised that he still had not been asked to leave. He enjoyed teaching Liza. He felt a great deal of satisfaction at the end of each day. Mr. Ridgway broached the subject of the garden to Liza as spring was approaching. "Would you like to help me on occasion, Liza?" he asked. "Yes, I have been thinking about my garden and William's. I would like to move all my roses to his garden. I would like to put some bushes in for bees. Buddleias would be nice, and that would bring in the bees and the butterflies. We could have a bird bath and a small bench for when William wants to visit," said Liza. "You can have what you like there, Liza," said Mr. Ridgway. "What would you like to do with your own garden?" "I think that I would like to change it into a herb garden, and I could learn all about what they are good for," said Liza. "I'll find a book on herbs," said Mr. Salmon. "Thank you, Mr. Salmon, you are very kind." On a few occasions Liza's father came to see what was happening in the garden, and he seemed happy with the way it was looking. Liza and Mr. Ridgway worked very hard on William's garden, and a small seat was built at the end, and Liza had been right. The buddleia bushes did bring in the bees and the butterflies. When at last a bird bath was put in place, she and Mr. Ridgway stood back and admired all the roses and the layout. Liza felt contented that William would have been pleased with what they had achieved, and as she looked, suddenly her tears flowed, and she found it impossible to stop. She sobbed so hard that Mr. Ridgway became worried, and quickly called for Mrs. Walsh to come out to the garden. She put an arm around Liza and led her to the seat, and they sat together for quite a while, until finally Liza got control of her emotions and apologised for being so stupid. "You have nothing to apologise for, Liza. It's only natural that you feel this way, and I'm sure you will probably feel better now," said Mrs. Walsh. Mr. Ridgway had gone into the house, and Mr. Salmon was in the kitchen with Betty, and he commented that it was probably the first time that Liza had cried since William had died, and that he hoped that she would start healing now. Liza and Mrs. Walsh came into the kitchen, and immediately Liza said that the next day they must start on her garden and sort out what she would need for it. "We'll all read your book tomorrow, and I'll see what I can find for you," said Mr. Ridgway. "I do know somebody who grows herbs, so we can go and visit her and see what she says." "That will be a good idea," said Mr. Salmon. "Just think, Liza, you will be learning something else which will set you up for the future." It didn't take long for them to accumulate herbs, some from seed and others from rooting them in water, and soon Liza's garden was full of all sorts of useful plants, but mostly she liked to spend a little time in William's garden, sitting on the seat and reading. 2 years after William's death, Mr. Salmon decided to leave. He had been looking increasingly unwell and was going to spend some time with his sister and her husband. Liza knew that he was dying, but they kept up the pretence that he was just going to take a small break from teaching. They made plans that he would write to her each week in a different language, and she would reply in that same language. There would be times when he would have to clarify something phonetically, but overall it would improve her language skills. He also encouraged her to study mathematics more than she had been doing, and she promised that she would. She was very sad on the day that he left, and she thanked him profusely for being such a good friend to her, and she knew that she would never see him again. Betty, Mrs. Walsh, and Mr. Ridgway were steadfast in their care for her, but her father then felt that she was probably lacking the skills that would make her a good wife, and he approached Sheila on the subject. "You'll have to train her in all forms of etiquette, Sheila," he said. "I have noticed that she spends too much time over her books or out digging in the garden. Commendable as it is not what would be required to make a good marriage." "I suppose you're right, but you know that she takes no notice of me," said Sheila. He didn't have the courage to point out that, as his wife took absolutely no notice of Liza, it was not surprising that the feeling was mutual. "Well, try, Sheila, otherwise she will never leave this house," said her father. When Liza was nearly 14 years old, she still had had no training from Sheila. She and Mr. Salmon had continued their correspondence as promised, but one day it stopped, and Liza knew that he had died. It was therefore no surprise to her when a large package arrived with a note from his sister telling her of his passing, and that it was his wish that she had all his educational books. She wrote to his sister conveying her sadness that he was no longer with them, and letting her know how kind he had been to her. She would put his books to very good use, and was touched that he had thought of her. "I've interviewed a governess for you, Liza," announced her mother one day. "She will be starting next week. She has many skills which will be useful to you in the future." Liza just nodded. She hoped that she would get on with the woman, and even if she didn't, the woman would never know. "I would have thought that it would have been a good idea to have been at least introduced to her," said Liza somewhat tartly. "I can see that your manners haven't improved, so it is just as well that we have someone who will put you through your paces," said Sheila. "Have you met my governess?" Liza asked Betty and Mrs. Walsh later. "Yes, we have. She seems very nice and quite young," said Mrs. Walsh. "Is she? I suppose that is something in her favour," said Liza. "You didn't meet her then?" said Mrs. Walsh. "No," said Liza, and she just shrugged. However, she was pleasantly surprised when the governess arrived. She was only about 18 years old, and seemed to have a very pleasing nature. Her name was Kate Templar, and she and Liza immediately found that they had a great deal in common. During her first week in employment, she appeared a little confused, and she decided to confide in Mrs. Walsh. "I was led to believe that Liza was in great need of being taught the niceties of mixing in certain circles of society, and that she was sadly lacking in etiquette. But that doesn't seem to be the case," said Kate. "I therefore feel that I am not earning my money." Mrs. Walsh pursed her lips and found it difficult to form her words. "Liza needs no such training. She has a natural ability to mix and make others feel important," said Mrs. Walsh. Kate continued to look confused, and Mrs. Walsh decided to speak her mind. "You are now part of this household, and therefore you should be privy to the way it has worked over the past few years. Mrs. Donoghue would not know whether or not Liza needed further training. She has not taken notice of her since her son died some years ago. In fact, she has never given Liza the time of day, let alone studied what she needs. It pains me to say that it was made abundantly clear to Liza that she was the wrong child to survive," said Mrs. Walsh. How Liza has grown into such a nice child is beyond me." Kate was frowning. Was she told that she was the wrong child to survive? "Yes, she was," said Mrs. Walsh. "Liza and her brother were very close. They lived for each other, and when he died it was heartbreaking for Liza. We have tried to make her life more acceptable, and I think she appreciates that. Her previous tutor, Mr. Salmon, taught her many things that most youngsters would not have understood, but he saw in her an intelligence that needed to be nurtured." "What happened to him?" asked Kate. "He worked here as long as he could, but he was ill and failing fast, so he left to go to his sister. He and Liza corresponded frequently until his death. He left her all his books, so she has continued to study, and I believe that her master of many languages is second to none. However, her skills in the kitchen and embroidery leave a great deal to be desired," said Mrs. Walsh. "Thank you, Mrs. Walsh. It has given me an insight into what I may be able to do for Liza, and of course your opinions will go no further than me," said Kate. "I think that you and Liza will get on famously, and you are near enough her age for you to become good friends," said Mrs. Walsh. "She needs a friend." Mrs. Walsh was right. Liza and Kate did get on famously. There was little that Kate needed to teach Liza as far as etiquette was concerned, but she did manage to help her improve her embroidery skills. But her culinary skills still left a great deal to be desired. Most of what she cooked was edible, but it never looked inviting. "I understand that you have spent too much time at home, Liza," said Kate. "We must go out more. I know that you get fresh air whilst in the garden, but a change of scenery will do you some good. I also believe that you should be given an allowance so that you can learn the value of money." "I suppose you are right. I will sound my father out and see what he says," said Liza. She knew that she should have had such an allowance a long while ago, so she was not frightened to tell her father what she wanted, and he immediately agreed, as she knew that he would. It was Liza's first visit to the stores in the town, and she needed to be guided by Kate. But the shopkeepers were very friendly, and Liza truly enjoyed the experience. Her mathematical training stood her in good stead. Kate insisted that they went into town at least twice a week, and sometimes they visited the local park. They made a very good-looking pair as they went from place to place, and many a young man's head was turned as they walked past. Surprisingly, Liza's mother began taking an interest in her, and often accompanied them to the park for a short walk. It was noticed that she seemed to know quite a number of people who were also taking the air. "Miss Templar is doing a very good job with your education, Liza," said her mother. "I think you are ready to accompany me to one or two of my friends for afternoon tea, and I will invite them here also on occasion." Liza stared at her mother and wondered what her motive was. "Why do you want me with you? You have never wanted that before," said Liza. "Well, it's about time you started mixing in the right circles," said Sheila Donoghue. Liza charmed all the people that she met, and Sheila took credit for Liza's good manners and interesting conversation. Each evening Liza began dining with her parents, and the topic of most conversations was which families had eligible sons, and Liza commented that she hoped that she was not being lined up for their inspection. One day Sheila announced that she had received a letter from an old acquaintance, and that unfortunately his wife had died, but he would be in Liverpool on business shortly, and wanted to visit, as there were one or two of his wife's items that he felt she may like. "You knew him well then, mother?" asked Liza. "Not well, but your father and I knew his wife better. She was one of my school friends, and of course your father came onto the scene as we became older," said Sheila. "Has he visited before?" asked Liza. "No, but apparently he is in the shipping business and has recently bought a hotel in the town, and he is expanding his business interests in Liverpool, so we may see a great deal more of him now," said Sheila. Liza's father was quiet on the subject, but Sheila continued that perhaps he could use her father's accounting skills with his business venture. Over the course of the next year to 18 months, James Marchant visited on just a couple of occasions, but Liza did not have the opportunity to meet him until one day when he called unexpectedly as she was sitting in the front garden reading. Liza was deep in concentration on her book, which was in French, and she had not noticed him arriving. "Good afternoon, young lady," said James Marchant, and Liza looked up startled and he seemed to be equally startled as he stared at her. "Good afternoon, sir. How can I help you?" said Liza. He seemed to regain his composure. "We have not met before. I'm James Marchant, and I presume you are young Liza. I am very pleased to meet you at last. You have always been busy whenever I have called." "Ah, yes, I have heard of you, sir. I'm afraid my parents are not at home at the moment. But may I offer you some refreshments? I am not sure when my mother is planning to return. Was there something that you particularly wanted to see them for?" asked Liza. "No, it is just a courtesy call, as I was in the neighbourhood. What are you reading?" he asked, and Liza showed him her book. "You read French then, Liza?" said James Marchant. "Yes, I enjoy languages. I had a very good tutor when I was younger, and my governess and I now try to perfect our language skills when we can," said Liza, and she smiled at him, and her bright green eyes sparkled with kindness. Once again he stared at her for a while, and then finally said, "Will you tell your parents that I called, and I will call again when I visit Liverpool next month. I am very pleased to have met you, Liza." "And I you, Mr. Marchant," said Liza. "I'll tell my parents that you called today." He left and thoughtfully made his way back to his office in town. James Marchant visited on a few occasions over the following year, and then one day a loud disagreement could be heard, followed by the front door being slammed closed. Within the hour he returned and let himself into the house. Mrs. Walsh and Betty were mystified, but decided that it was not their business, so they said nothing to Liza or Kate on their return from a walk in the park. It was with a great deal of surprise and horror that Liza was told that she was to marry soon after her 17th birthday. Liza stood in front of her parents and demanded to know who they thought she was going to marry, and that she had no intention of doing so. "You will do so," said her mother. "You have been made an offer by James Marchant, and we have accepted that offer on your behalf." "Although a gentleman, he is old enough to be my father, and I have no desire to marry him or anyone else for that matter," said Liza. Her father stepped in, telling her that it was a very suitable match. "He is a very kind man, and he is not without funds. You will never want for anything." "I don't care about his wealth. I do not wish to marry him," said a defiant Liza. "You will marry him, Liza. It is arranged. And if you look at the positive side of it, in a few years' time you will still be relatively young and become a wealthy widow," said Sheila Donoghue. "That's a terrible thing to insinuate," said Liza as she stormed out of the room. "What's the matter, Liza? You look furious," said Kate, and Liza told her what was being planned for her future. "You're much too young for such a man," said Kate. "I know he seems very kindly, but you're not ready for marriage to him or anybody." "I am told that it has been arranged," said Liza. "I suppose I could run away, but where would I go? And I have no funds. I dare say I could become a governess." "I'll talk to them, Liza," said Kate. "I'll make them realise that you are not yet ready for marriage, and that you should really eventually marry someone nearer your own age." "Thank you, Kate, but I don't think that it'll do any good. No, I'm going to have to run away," said Liza. Kate smiled and said that she didn't think that it would come to that, but the outcome of Kate's conversation with Liza's parents was her immediate dismissal from the household. Liza was locked in her room and not given the opportunity to say goodbye. She was now alone and felt Kate's loss, but when she thought about the situation, she decided that a life with James Marchant was infinitely better than the life that she had in the Donoghue household, so sullenly she bowed to the inevitable and let all the arrangements for her wedding go on around her. Liza's adult life story continues in the first book of the series, For All Time. These early life short stories are an introduction to the popular Liza Marchant series of books. Next is James Marchant's life prior to his entrance in the first in the series, entitled For All Time. If you are enjoying these stories, please hit the like and subscribe buttons to this channel.